All right, now we are cooking with fire.
Indeed we are. Lots of fire.
Lots of fire. So welcome back to Coffee Talk. Today we are here with Gregory, the greatest who has ever lived, for our redo from our last take here.
Can't believe you messed up the audio, Adam.
I did.
We put a lot of work into that conversation.
We did. We talked for certainly over an hour, but maybe closer to an hour and a half. And the audio didn't work. Why? There was a simple button that I had to hit. It transferred from this board that was here to the computer, and I did not do that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
every audio bit that we had talked about, every nugget, every little bite of goodness, gone. That was frustrating. But we're back at it for take number 2.
Indeed.
And we just did a little test, so the sound is working.
Yes.
So
Very
you
nice.
should be able to hear this. This will be a great conversation.
Okay.
As it always is. I feel like we always
have good chats.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. I actually just finished lunch.
Mm-hmm. Delicious. Pretty good.
It was pretty good.
I was whelmed.
It was whelming. Right?
Yes.
We went to Jersey Mike's, and it was
Not sponsored, by the way.
not sponsored. So don't feel obligated to support us through them because we don't get a cent, right? But we did go there, and it was actually pretty good. I had my doubts walking into the line because I'm watching them make the subs. Aside from the fact that it was way overpriced,
Agreed. Definitely agreed.
it was still a pretty decent sub.
Yeah.
So
I enjoyed it.
not bad, not bad. If you hear us digesting through our microphones,
You could definitely... It proves that we have the sound going, you know?
yeah,
It's better than last time when you could hear nothing.
right. So, anyways, we're glad that you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
So
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
yeah, least I can do for screwing up our last conversation. Okay, so we had conversations last time
We did.
about writing and storytelling
Oh, yes.
that everybody missed out on, that we just purely entertained ourselves with.
Mm-hmm.
But today doesn't have to be just that.
Okay.
Maybe that's just a lost
Yeah.
episode. We just chalk it up.
Who knows what tangents upon tangents will go on.
You never know. And today I am not drinking coffee because after eating a big walloping sub, coffee just didn't fit. I've got some water here.
Yeah, it's got water talk. Nothing that sounds lamer
is-
than water talk, but it's good.
It's water talk.
Water's important. Drink water.
It's, well, getting closer to summertime, so you want
Yeah.
to stay hydrated, folks.
Mhm.
Anyways, we're glad you're here. Greg, let us actually start talking a bit about the end of your semester here.
Oh, okay.
So you're at the end. Maybe you can tell the people.
Yes.
Where are you going? What are you studying? What's your hopes and dreams?
Oh, my hopes and dreams. That's a good question that I don't know if I have the answer to right now. But I am, we'll say, going into my senior year of Canisius College, where I'm studying, or Canisius University now.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah. Sorry.
That
Yeah.
is a big change.
It is a big change that totally changes everything about the school. You know, everything. Earth shattering. Yeah. I have mixed feelings about it, but it's cool.
I feel like I got an upgrade. I'm a grift myself.
Yes.
And so I went from college to university overnight.
Yeah. True. I will be part of the first class to graduate from Canisius University.
Wow.
Yeah. Assuming that I get all my stuff done so I can still graduate a year early. But, yeah.
Well.
It's exciting.
Okay. So, what are you studying?
So, I am studying creative writing and philosophy.
And this is why we were having this conversation during the last coffee talk, talking about writing.
Yes.
Right. And
I do a lot of that.
he does and it's not even like, I do a lot of writing. Like, you do a lot of writing. Your goals, your writing goals have produced a lot of fruit.
Oh, Okay. Yeah, I guess I would say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So
1,200 pages of fruit. It's still going. But, yeah.
1,200 pages.
Yeah. That's how long, roughly how long the novel is right now.
Man, that's awesome. Do you want to share a little bit about your writing experience? What is putting you into this writing sphere? What in your life has kind of brought you to that? And what do you like to write?
What do I like to write? Okay, so for my entire life, I've enjoyed reading from the time when I could read, and it was just something I always did. Something that I was always reading some sort of book, even if it was very rare that I had time to read, like it was during this past semester. But I always have, if anyone comes up to me and asks me at any point, "What are you reading?" I will have an answer because I'm always reading something, just for fun, for enjoyment, and I've just always enjoyed that. And when I was in like second grade, roughly, I was in my class, and we had writing assignments. We had to write like a story about like Halloween, for example, or something like that. And I just wrote these like 2-page stories that were poorly written, but I guess they were good. My teacher said they were good, so I guess they were good for a second grader. And so I started writing some stuff on the side. I had like this weird novel idea thing about some weird clock or something in second grade that I started to do. I still have like the first like 3 chapters of that were relatively low quality, but they're at home in a drawer in my desk somewhere. And from then on, I was writing kind of on and off throughout the rest of elementary school into middle school. I would have like a story idea, so I would, just try to write it. There were several attempts at writing this one story that I still will probably write someday, and that it's changed forms a lot since then. But I've written on and off a lot, and so in a lot of different ways. Generally, what I like to read and write is science fiction and fantasy. More of the latter, actually, more fantasy generally. And so that 1,200-page novel that isn't even done yet is a fantasy novel. And that's generally what I write, although I also write a little bit of poetry. One of the classes that I'm not actually finished with it. I have to finish the project tonight for this semester, was a class called Advanced Poetry Writing, and I really kind of enjoyed that, delving deeper into poetry and giving the form a try. And a lot of my poems are about my Catholic faith. I've written probably half of the poems I've written in my life I've written in the Adoration Chapel.
Wow.
And it's just, yeah, I do experiment a little bit, but generally what I write is science fiction, fantasy.
We've talked about writing for a while, and I actually didn't know that you wrote poetry.
Yeah.
Wow. So we're gonna see a collection by Greg James?
It's theoretically possible.
Hmm.
Yeah.
How soon?
I don't know. I have a lot less knowledge of publishing poetry than I do about publishing novels, so I don't really know how that process works. And I don't write poetry nearly as often as I write fantasy and just fiction stuff in general.
So what do you like about a good story?
What do I like about a good story? I think I tend to be a very character-focused reader, so there's, of course, the main elements of any story: character, setting, plot. I would argue theme can fit in there too. So I would say I actually probably focus on plot the least, because plot is what and I think there's a lot of readers who agree with me, it's not what you remember when you finish a story as much. You might remember the characters, they kind of stick in your head because you're almost living in that character's mind for a while. So I remember a lot of characters a lot better than I remember stories, or than I remember plot. And setting's cool, but you can have a amazing setting, right? full of world building and these really amazing cultures. And then you can have awful characters that are like one dimensional and don't have any like meat to them. And you can have an awful plot, and then that's a bad story. But if you have a story with good characters and good plot, but generally a bit weaker setting, something that's maybe a bit cliche or something like that, you can still have a really good story, right? And so, what I think makes a story the best that it can be is if it has really strong characters and characters who have just really complex, intricate things going on in their present and their past and conflicts. And so I think that's, I don't even remember the original question, but I think that's just what I get the most out of in a story is from seeing the characters and seeing what they're striving for, seeing how they change from the beginning to the end. Because we're all characters on our own journey as well, and we're all striving to do things that often aren't quite as big or as monumental as things that characters in fantasy novels are doing, but are still important journeys that we're all called to go
Yeah. So, what would you say is an example of a good story
on. Ooh.
that you would line up? And maybe it's not your favorite, but that you could say, like, all right, here is a story that just lines up great character arcs, sets the stage for a good environment. How would you actually lay that out as an example?
That's a great question. There's a lot of good stories, but the first I think thing that comes to my mind is in terms of like the fantasy field. Now, granted, and we've talked about this before, I haven't read The Lord of the Rings. I know you guys can shame me all you want for that. It's on my list. I'll get to it.
I'm not here to shame you, Greg. I'm not here to. I'm just here to encourage you.
Yes.
Into the.
I will read it eventually. I swear.
Okay.
And so I haven't read The Lord of the Rings, but The Wheel of Time is really solid. It does have some weaker parts in it, but it has complex, intricate characters that each have their own role to play. But I think, see, that's a complete story because it's a series, just 14 books that is finished. But the series that really sticks out to me the most are having really complex characters, and I would consider it a virtuous story too, for the most part, because there are some stories like A Song of Ice and Fire, which is the series upon which Game of Thrones is inspired, and there are some characters in there who are striving for virtue, and some who definitely aren't, and there are people like that in real life. But when I read, I did enjoy reading the books in A Song of Ice and Fire. I prefer to see characters striving to be virtuous and striving for honor. And a series that I think is very emblematic of that is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. It's not finished, but the first 4 books are really solid. They are long, which I guess is kind of fitting for someone who's in the process of writing a novel that's going to be more than 1,200 pages. But it's really just a solid series.
Mm. Wow. Do you have a favorite in the midst of your reads that you would go back to time and time and again, that you would pick up again? Or do you just kind of move on and just keep it in the past?
So I generally just keep kind of churning through books, but I always like to at least think about the things that I want to reread. So occasionally I'll pull out a series. I have a very odd system for how I organize the books that I'm reading when I read them. Basically, like right now I'm scheduled for like the next 20 or so books that I read for fun. I've already planned it out pretty significantly, pretty like set in stone. And so, but within that list of like the next 20 books I'm going to read, there's a series that I'm going to reread in there, and that's the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. Very good, another unfinished series. But I'm going to be coming back to that to reread the first 2 books in there. That's probably the next series I'm going to reread. And Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, which is kind of an interconnected universe that includes the Stormlight Archive, is I kind of go back to his works quite often as well and try and fit them back in, especially before a new one comes out. So the seventh book in his Mistborn series, which is another part of that kind of umbrella universe of the Cosmere, came out last fall. So I was like, okay, I have to reread all of the Mistborn books before that one comes out. So I kind of fit that into the weird rotation system that I have.
Well, so I don't normally go back to read books again. And I have. There are some books that I have done that with, but usually I'm kind of looking forward to the next one. An exception to this rule is The Lord of the Rings.
Of course.
Now, I've only read the 3 books once, and I've been through other Tolkien books since. But I am due to read them again, actually pretty soon. I'm probably going to pick them up again in the fall.
Okay.
And start right from the beginning with the Fellowship, make my way through. That was a story that is worth reading again and again.
Yeah,
and
that's what I've heard.
Yeah, and at some point, I'm probably going to read that with my kids. I would love to be able to do that. Sit down and just go through Lord of the Rings with Izzy, Wyatt, and Kateri. There's just so much that is taken away from the trilogy. It's just a great story. So adventure, you've got action, you have just that real sense of fellowship that's built into it. And it's like, well, the Fellowship of the Rings, but you have camaraderie that's in the midst of that. And then there's a much deeper lore that travels a lot of time that I think is really cool to be immersed in. And the way that Tolkien wrote, he had a lot of theology that was in the midst of his story. And so it's a very faithful story.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that, because I know I was taking a course on environmental ethics this semester, and there was a student in there who was just like a big fan of Lord of the Rings. She had like a tablet case that was Lord of the Rings themed, multiple shirts that she wore throughout the year that had that. But she was very much, I guess, on the I'm not trying to say there can't be liberal Catholics, of course, but liberal, very much anti-Catholic side. And I'm like, how can you read Tolkien? From my understanding, and I have read The Hobbit and other works by Tolkien, not The Lord of the Rings, unfortunately. Eventually, as I said, I will. But it's like...
No pressure.
Yes, of course. It's like, how can you almost read Tolkien and be so, like, anti-Catholic? And it's like, I mean, it's possible. Like, I walked into Barnes & Noble a few months ago, and there was a Tolkien, like, tarot deck just sitting on the shelves. And it's like, how could you do that to Tolkien's work? Because it's good to have faithful Catholic authors. And it's like you're just kind of ruining that work by by relating it to other objects that don't share those values and are emblematic of things that Tolkien likely would have hated.
Yeah, in a way, it's you're taking something that he cared deeply about, and throwing it on the side for the sake of the sale.
Mm-hmm.
And Tolkien certainly would have been against the occult.
Yes.
And he uses a lot of magic and fantasy elements in the story, obviously.
Yeah, but, okay, and granted, you've read a lot more than I have, but my understanding is that the magic in the world of Middle-earth is kind of baked into that good versus evil. Like, there's the magic of the good and of God. I don't remember exactly what it's called in Lord of the Rings. And then there's the kind of magic of the evil side as well. Is that correct, generally?
Yeah. And you have 2 sources of power.
Exactly.
You have power from who is essentially the one almighty God. Mm-hmm. And then you had power from one of his angels, essentially.
Yes.
That has fallen. Mm-hmm. And the creation story in the Silmarillion, which is the story that kind of builds to the Lord of the Rings, really kind of lays all of that out.
Yeah.
There's a huge arc that comes to that, this good versus evil. And the magic really is just a source of power from one source or another. Mm-hmm. And so you're delving into one source or another's worth of power. And who do you choose? Who do you serve? Mm-hmm. So boy, we could just. Oh, you know, we're going to do a Lord of the Rings episode
We
after
have
you are
to,
done
yes.
because I feel like there's a lot that we can jump into.
Mm-hmm.
And if I keep going, I'm going to start ruining
Yeah.
like some really cool elements for you
Yeah.
when you're reading it.
I already have probably had quite a few things ruined for me, but not everything.
Yeah.
And I don't want everything to be ruined for me.
Yeah, but what I love about Lord of the Rings, they're deep books, so like there's a lot to them. So as you're reading it, there's a lot that you can kind of put your roots into and draw out of. In some ways, at least from the first time that I read it, I had really enjoyed the adventure piece, and I really started seeing the shimmers of what the theology piece was. As I have gone through some of the other books, you see more of that in some detail, and you listen to a lot of commentary. You know, like you jump onto YouTube and you're hearing podcasts about some of the angles that Tolkien was taking, but you really can draw a lot more out of those books than just a first time through. So I think it's a deep well. If people ruin some things for you, you're gonna find a lot more surprises.
So, controversial opinion, actually. I don't mind having things spoiled for me.
Really?
I generally don't actively seek them out, but if something does get spoiled for me, like, or if I have a question about the story or the world, or something that I'm trying to remember, I will actually look at like wikis online to kind of refamiliarize myself with some things, even at the risk of spoiling myself. Because I read for the sake of the story, and to me, I don't like understanding how the story ends specifically. That's only the ending, right? The story's much longer and more detailed. There's a lot more depth to it than just like, Darth Vader's Luke's father, the end. There's a lot more depth to it than just kind of like these bombshell moments that are like the twists or the ending. So I don't mind it. I don't actively seek it out, but it doesn't ruin the experience for me, as I know it does for a lot of other people.
I don't like spoilers.
Yeah.
And when I sit down and I am, especially with some new movies that are coming out,
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen Ant-Man, and I'm looking forward to seeing the new Guardians, right?
Okay. I haven't seen an MCU movie in like a year. It's kind of unfortunate.
What else has been out there? Because I feel like the last one I saw was Doctor Strange.
That was the last one I saw too.
Yeah, that was
interesting.
I didn't love it.
I'd agree with that assessment.
There were parts of the movie that I really actually enjoyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Man, they dove way too deep into demons.
Yeah.
And demonology, and I'm like...
And kind of glorified it.
Yeah. And I'm not into that. Right?
Yeah.
That's not something we as the faithful should be sitting there and being like,
yeah.
Oh, that's a good part of the story.
Like, the way they painted it was almost like, you can delve into the demonic. Yes, there's risks, but it could be worth the risk sometimes. But it's never worth the risk.
It's never worth the risk, right?
Yeah.
And that should be the lesson coming out of this. And I think one of the big things here is he felt like he can control the demons.
Yes.
If only I'm strong enough, and I think that I am, I can control the demons, right? And you cannot control the demons.
Yeah.
Right? They're controlling you. And so I walked away from that movie feeling like, man, if only they just called up The Exorcist.
Yeah.
Just bring them in. And you would have fixed all of this, right? Maybe you guys just need to turn your life over to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Doctor Strange.
Yeah, well, the priests are the real heroes in the world, right?
Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
So back to the new movies that are coming out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to know anything about them. I want to step into it knowing nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I've been playing Minefield a little bit, or Minesweeper, where I'm just stepping on YouTube channels, and I'm really careful to watch what actually pops up, because everyone's talking about the new movies that are coming out there.
Mm-hmm.
And even just a simple scroll will be like, this movie bombed. This movie was great. And you don't want to know it. I don't know it.
Yeah.
But,
so, I do enjoy watching movies without spoilers and reading books without spoilers, but I don't think experiencing spoilers takes away the enjoyment for me. So, well, that's the bottom line, for my opinion, I think, on that.
Okay. So you're writing stories now.
Mm-hmm.
You have some books in the fire that you're working on.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit on what works you're putting together?
Yes.
What do you think?
I definitely can. So, right now, I'm writing a really long epic fantasy novel. Its working title is The Soul of the Sea, and I do like that title, so if I can keep using it, I will try to. I don't know if I'll end up getting it published. It's possible that I can seek that out. It's possible that I might not. We'll see when I'm done. But it's a pirate-based fantasy novel that revolves around different characters in different places and how their arcs sort of interweave. But at its core, it's about there are these. So the main religion of the world, and I won't say whether it's true or false that all the claims this religion makes are true or false, because that's like there's some twists related to it. But there are, well, I guess first I should explain what the world is. It's the Etched Isles. It's like these 8 islands that were created by these 8 gods, as far as we know. That's the cosmology that at least the people who live in the world know. That may or may not be true. But they built these islands and helped the people and, created them and guided them to the point of civilization, and then just sort of left. Or, well, they also defeated like this really weird, strange force of darkness called the Untamed, and no one knows where they came from or such. And so after they defeated the Untamed and civilization was generally achieved, they left. No one knows where they went, but there are these souls, these gemstones called spirins that form the basis of the magic system for the world, and it's essentially you can sort of channel some of the memories of people who have mostly generally died, but in this case with these gods, it's they can there's the souls of these gods somehow scattered as their last gift around these islands. And so essentially the story centers around this girl named Nywin, about on the cusp of adulthood, we'll say, and she there's an evil empire that attacks her home, so she is sent away by her mother, who was basically a protector of one of these mysterious artifacts called like the soul of the goddess of the sea. And so she is sent away so that that secret can be safe and protected, along with her adopted brother, Tarna, who was once a pirate, and then kind of washed up mysteriously on their island. And what else? Oh, and so they're traveling away, and their ship gets taken by pirates. And so then, to save, and Nywin gives away that secret to save her life, and then it basically becomes just a treasure hunt to find that object, the soul of the sea. And there's 2 other characters as well. There's the evil empire, who is also after these treasures, and there's the another character at the location of where the nation where the soul of the sea is hidden, who is trying to cobble together an alliance from this succession war that's happening on that island, because we'll say the queen, although she's really called the kin mistress, died, leaving no heir, and then there's a succession war as well. So there's a number of different things that are sort of combining and being integrated, but at the core, it's a treasure hunt story. Yeah.
And so you have 1,500 pages.
1,200.
1,200 pages.
Yes.
What kind of discipline does it take to be able to sit down and write that much?
Just developing a daily writing habit. That's the biggest advice that the biggest, I guess, advice that helped me, at least, and the biggest advice that I could give to any aspiring writers who might be listening. Because for a while, I started this novel in May of 2021, right after I graduated high school. And it took me a couple months. I also worked at a summer camp that summer, so I didn't have a lot of time to write. But once, the fall rolled around and I realized, okay, I need to write this. I'd only written about 7 chapters, although I ended up throwing out the original version, the 7th chapter. But so I written like the first 7 chapters, and it just kind of felt like it was going pretty slowly. So I decided, okay, I'm going to write every morning from 6 a.m. to 7:30, because I'm an early riser. I'm a morning person. So that's what I did. And there are some times where I take breaks to work on other projects, or when I use that time for schoolwork towards like the end of the semester. So these past few weeks I haven't really had a lot of time to write because I've been using my writing time to work on, because a lot of my classes had major papers due towards the end of the semester, of course. So I used my writing time to work on those. But that's, just disciplining yourself enough to have that daily habit, even if it's just for 15 minutes, and using the time solely for writing, making that sort of your focus, is definitely benefited me. And so, yeah, it's just been fruitful.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that is being productive. I mean, to have that type of a discipline to sit down and write and accomplish a goal is admirable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when you sit down and you have an idea, you started with an idea that you said, hey, I want to be able to put this to ink or computer screen. Do you type it out, or
I do type it.
Okay. So how do you even get started with just an original idea that you want to be able to maybe start with? What would be your process of, hey, I have an idea, or I'm kind of scratching around with a few thoughts. Where do you go from that first phase of beginning to actually getting started? Do you kind of sketch it out first? You just get started and just come what may? What's your approach to that?
That's a good question. So for me, it started. Well, I'll kind of trace the novel I'm working on now from where I began with it, because this is not the, I guess, like the typical process for writers, but for me, this one kind of came about out of like a brute force sort of thing. Like I was like, okay, I want to write a pirate story, and then it sort of just like developed from there. A lot of times, and with story ideas I've had since then, it's been little bits and pieces of story that I've been threading together. But I'm like, okay, I need an idea for a story. At that point, I wanted to write a novella, just kind of get myself started, finishing up a longer work. So I was expecting it to be like 150 pages at most. And then I was like, okay, I just want to write like a pirate story. So I had this idea for like pirate necromancers, and that sort of evolved into this idea of these pirates who can sort of communicate with the dead in that way of like the souls or the spirens, as I mentioned. Being able to at least get the memories and abilities of those who died. Because of course I couldn't put something in there where it's like their souls get trapped or something like that. Because so back then with my ideas, I wasn't focused on preaching my faith through my stories. Now I am a bit more, but back then, like when I had first started plotting this out, it wasn't focused on that. But it's obviously not their souls being trapped. So that would be I couldn't do something that was so outrageously like I guess it would be against our faith, or at least not aligning with what we believe. But I need to keep the cosmology at least somewhat similar. to our world and how we understand our world. But anyway, how I was kind of building this out was it started with kind of like pirate necromancers, and I had an idea for like a treasure hunt sort of story, the one that I'm doing now. Originally, it was just going to be 3 central characters, which is a lot for a 100-page novella or so. But it was going to be Nywin, her adopted brother, who I mentioned before, and the captain of the ship that captures them. Mm-hmm. And so I started writing the first 3 chapters. This was actually the summer of 2020. And so I guess this idea first came into development in the summer of 2020. And then I showed them to one of my English teachers. I was still in high school back then, so in the fall of that year, I was fortunate enough that I went to a private school, so I was very fortunate that we could go back to school kind of full time after the pandemic. So I kind of showed my English teacher them. He said he'd read them. He read through those first 3 chapters, and he was like, Greg, you need to understand this is not a novella-length story. This is a long story. He picked up a copy of the first book of The Wheel of Time, which is like this thick, and he's like, this needs to be like about this big, and it's probably longer than that at this point. And I was like, okay, so I sat down, I reevaluated, I kind of shifted some things. I added another character, which was the character that represents the evil empire, because you kind of need that villain sort of element to it, but I didn't want it to be the evil emperor himself, because that felt too, I don't know, it felt like it would be more interesting to have just one of his soldiers. So there was a period where I was kind of building from that, but I didn't really start putting something together in earnest. I tried writing the first chapter again, and I didn't like how it sounded at all, so I just sort of abandoned it. Wrote a couple other like short stories, because I joined a writing club that we finally started towards the end of my senior year, so I kind of took a break from this project. And then once May rolled around, I sat down and I was like, okay, I need to figure this story out. So I kind of built out like I said, we started with pirate necromancers. Then, I wanted the magic system to kind of connect to the treasure that they were searching for, and so I built that out. And then the characters were still generally the same. So the same 4 characters that I had in the version of the outline I made after my English teacher told me to expand it. And I added another character, which was the character in the Succession War. And I expanded it a lot, made a pretty detailed outline that's probably about, the outline itself is probably about 20 pages long. And I kind of laid that out, figured out the general beats for the story, and then I sat down and started writing. And what I do, so I got this from, or this is what I understood that Brandon Sanderson did in one of his writing lectures on YouTube, was he has his full broad outline, but then every few chapters, I think he said 5 or so, he outlines in detail, like very close detail, every 5 chapters. So I outlined the first 5 chapters, and once I got to the end of there, I outlined the next 5 chapters, and then I did, I think, the next 7, because that got me to the end of part 1. And so that's what I did, and because the story has shifted and evolved from that outline that I developed after I graduated back in May of 2021. So, but I guess now I still have a lot of story ideas, and I've kind of pushed them off until I'm done with the novel I'm working on. But now, where a lot of my story ideas come from is I have these little like fragments of ideas. Like I'll have an idea for a world, like, man, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Like a world, like a city of, like a very small city. Like I wanted to I had an idea for like a story that would take place just in like one city for the entire time. But I called it like the city of, the number constantly changes, but some number, so we'll say like 11 chapels or something, and it would be a very like faith-based story where it was like these different chapels and things like that were a big part of the plot, and each one kind of having a different function. And that sort of ended up combining with I guess this is another setting idea that I had for something called the Triad, which is three people who are chosen by the God in this world, by God, whose values and such align with our understanding of God in our world, to be his for him to speak directly to, and do his work. And I kind of based that around the archangels that we know of, so Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael, and I kind of built a magic system around them, along with the theological and cardinal virtues as well.
Wow.
And I kind of combined that with, let's see, sort of like a couple character ideas I had for like one member of the triad in this idea is a person who is like who doesn't want that role of being one of the triad, but she's just sort of temporarily has that mantle until another person is ready for it. And so that was sort of like another idea that I had, kind of related to my thinking about the triad, but also not. And it's just a lot of like these fragments of ideas that I slowly integrate together.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you have started to put faith into your writings a little more frequently or more intentionally.
Yeah, more intentionally, definitely.
Okay, more intentionally. So what does that mean? Like what does it mean for you as a writer? Like the works that you're putting out.
Yeah.
How is it that you want to be able to interject that in?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that I've been doing, the kind of like I think the whole time that I've been trying to write these longer novels, is all of my main characters, protagonists, if you will, the character that is the center of the story, they are striving to be virtuous, striving to live a moral life in general. That doesn't mean they always do it the best way, but that's not like a lot of stories these days. It's kind of like the darker fantasy where it focuses on like anti-heroes and things like that, where it's kind of like Machiavellian at times, if the end justifies the means. My stories generally have always been, at least in my, I guess this later stage of writing, when I kind of decided I want to be a writer, they have been kind of focused on cultivating good moral life and virtue, for one thing. And then, additionally, just kind of like some of the themes I'm starting to kind of put in now, like with the triad idea, which I haven't started writing yet, but it's about doing God's will, and that's kind of a very central theme to that, and kind of struggling with what that means. And then it's just like, I guess mostly it's in the values as well, and the values that the characters hold. But it's something I'm still kind of trying to work through and figure out how exactly I want to do this. But I think, because there's times when you don't want to be too overt about it, but also, you don't want to be, you want to at least make an impression. There's another author named Brent Weeks, whose works that I haven't read, but he's Christian, and apparently, I don't know how I missed this, because I knew about him, but I didn't know he was Christian. He has major Christian themes apparently in his works, and apparently it's pretty obvious to see that. So I look forward to delving into his stuff soon as well. But to see how he does it. But it's something I'm still trying to figure out, trying to find the right balance, because I want to tell good stories that are also good representations of the world and of people, because not everyone in our world, right, is striving towards a life of faith and towards those things, and it's unfortunate. So I want to still, and I know representation is a very loaded word these days, but I want to make sure I represent the world well, how it is. So that's why in the story I'm working on now, I do have a side character that is what I guess in our world would be termed as bisexual. I don't glorify it or anything like that, but I try to depict situations that would happen in our world. I don't glorify it. I definitely don't. None of my main characters would belong to any part of that community or anything like that. But it's a tough line, tough balance to hit.
So you have, I guess, in an essence, you're building up that faith and virtue in your stories. Would you call them Christian stories, or would you kind of realm in fantasy and keep those undertones unattached from the title? If that makes sense.
That's a difficult question. I think it depends actually on the story, because the pirate story I'm writing now definitely cannot be shelved in any Christian section at any bookstore. But those stories that I was talking about the triad and things like that, could probably, but I still want fantasy readers to pick them up almost and read them.
Yeah.
And because you can write a story that has Christian themes without, I don't know how I want to say this, without like making it seem like it's an explicitly Christian story. And so there will probably be some stories that I write under like an explicitly Christian sort of umbrella, but there will probably also be stories that I write because I just want people to read them. And I also don't want people to pick up a book expecting it to be like having extraordinary Christian themes. When in reality it's just like a fantasy book about, characters fighting a battle against like an evil king or something like that. Because that's a story that can be enjoyed by people who aren't just Christians.
Right.
And I want to kind of maximize the reach of my stories too. Because as an author, one of my goals is to, even if it's not like explicitly or extraordinarily done, but like change people's lives in some subtle way, And the more that people are willing to read it, because we have to admit, there is a stigma against Christianity in a lot of places in our world, and that could alienate potential readers who would enjoy the work and who would also learn a lot from it.
Right. And it's also a business, right?
That too, yeah.
So you have a part of writing that you want to be creative and you can put something out there.
Yeah.
Let's say it's really good, but if you're not working on an audience or who are you writing to, then it's going to sit on your shelf and get dusty, right? So I would imagine on some sense you have to think of who do I want to be able to write this to and build up that readership.
Because as far as I know, Tolkien is shelved in fantasy and not in Christian literature or anything like that. Yes, his work has a lot of Christian themes, but it's something that people who aren't Christian can definitely enjoy and read and get something out of, and maybe even get pushed towards Christian faith or Catholicism even. And so I think that's where I want to be is on. I'm definitely not going to try and equate myself with Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or anything like that. I want to be my own self as a writer, of course, and it would be great to have as many readers as they do, but I kind of want to be in that sort of space where it has Christian themes, but it's not explicitly Christian. It's not like, and even at times, like C.S. Lewis kind of pushed the envelope a little bit in having like very much, I don't know how much of the series you're familiar with, but it's very allegorical, with a character who is a Christ-like figure pretty explicitly in some of the stories. So,
are you talking about Narnia?
Yes, I am. So I don't want to spoil too much if you haven't read too much of it.
I've only seen the movies.
Okay.
So that's the extent of it. But
yeah, so Aslan, as you know from seeing the movies, is pretty much the embodiment or the personification, let's find out the right word, of Christ within that series.
Yeah.
And so I want to kind of be in that space where there are Christian themes, as I said probably a few times by now, but it's not like this guy is Jesus dying for us in the book or anything like that. So it's a tough balance, but yeah. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for, but
I'm not looking for any answer.
mm-hmm.
I'm just posing a question.
Yeah.
So, if maybe to bring this insider writers workshop maybe kind of full circle here,
Yeah.
for somebody who wants to get started,
Okay.
who has an idea, or maybe they have no idea, but would like to be able to write a story at some time, and maybe apply a faithful measure to that, how would you encourage somebody to get started?
Well, this isn't a tip for how to start writing exactly, but read, of course. Read a lot, read as much as you can. Read widely, too. So, I mostly read fantasy and science fiction, but I also enjoy a lot of other genres as well, and I will read them, of course. And to read widely, read fiction, nonfiction, at least expose yourself to it. But as for steps just to begin writing, one thing that is a very common question that, as far as I know, that authors get is like, where do you get your ideas? Well, you can get your ideas from anywhere. You just kind of need to almost turn on a part of your brain, kind of shift your mindset to the point where it's like you're kind of walking along and you have like a story idea. You know, you just kind of see something that triggers part of your mind into kind of thinking like, oh, hey, it could be a really interesting setting sort of thing, like something you see as you're walking maybe, or you know, you're watching a movie and you see a character and you're like, okay, that's a cool character, but maybe it would be cool if he was a blacksmith instead of a beggar or something like that, and you kind of take things in that new direction, and you know, have a document or a notebook. I usually use my phone for this, where I write down these ideas when I have them. So actually, I can give you just an example of some of the things that are in there, just so that people can know what to look for.
Okay.
And a lot of times it just kind of comes out of nowhere. Really, it's hard to describe. It'll just be like a thought that sort of pops into your head. Ideas. Future ideas. Now, I haven't edited this document in a while, I think, but like, I just had a phrase that popped into my head once that was "clouds away," and I'm like, that's a pretty cool title. So that was one. One day I was playing with like a rope or something for whatever reason, maybe tying knots for Boy Scouts or something, and I had this kind of idea for a magic system in my head that was based on kind of, it's almost cowboy-like, but how you move a rope around, and like that particular formation that you kind of twist the rope around to affect the weather, things like that. So these like little random things that popped into my mind that I was doing kind of triggered these interesting ideas, but it definitely requires a bit of a mindset shift to be looking for those ideas. But then if you have a couple ideas, things that you want to kind of combine and integrate, or if you even have just one idea like pirate necromancers that you want to brute force kind of build a story from just that one idea, you know, sit down. There's no one way to write. As you could probably tell, I'm very much an outline writer, so I have very long outlines. I kind of have the whole story planned out before I even begin to write the first page. But a lot of writers aren't like that. That doesn't work for some people. There's two different types of writers, but with the caveat that it's really not two different types. It's just a spectrum, more like. There's what are often called architects and what are often called gardeners. Architects are the ones who have the whole foundation for the story built ahead of time. They have these plans laid out very well, and that's kind of where I am. I'm more on that side of having an outline. But then there's also discovery writers, or gardeners, as I said before. which have just kind of a basic idea, maybe a couple events along the way, and maybe an ending that they're building to, and then they just start writing. And if you can do that, that's beautiful as well. That's great. But for me, I need that outline first. So that next step for me is sitting down and writing the outline. But
Yeah.
it's important that you have that time to write as well. Because a lot of people kind of pursue like, hey, I want to be a writer, but they don't want to actually do the writing to make them a writer. Like there's a few people online that I've kind of run into who just in like comment sections and things like that who are sort of in that space. Uh, Even some of my like classmates at school, you know, they're great people, but a lot of them aren't putting the time in to actually be uh, a writer, and they're in college, so they have lots of time ahead of them. But you know, it's important that you have the time to write and that you actually sit down and write, as difficult as it can be. And then I also recommend reading books on writing. For a long time, for me, it was this book called Spilling Ink, which is more geared towards middle school writers. But it really kind of I read it over and over again throughout middle school because it just had such good tips for writing. Now I have a couple older books for more geared towards adult writers that I haven't fully read, but and I can't even remember what they're called. But excuse me, finding some good writing books uh, that can give you much better advice than I could give you. So, yeah.
Well, that in itself is good advice, right?
Yeah.
To be able to give somebody some tools to be able to work with. I mean, that's the name of the game.
Yeah, no writing advice is good for every single writer. Every writer is different, so it's important that you find what works for you. That's like the most important thing that I can say. And, another good resource, and this is what really put me on the path towards focusing on writing as a potential career, was Brandon Sanderson, who I've mentioned a few times in this episode. He is a teacher, I think adjunctly, at Brigham Young University in Utah. And he runs a course on writing science fiction fantasy. And he has, every few years, he posts the lectures from that course on YouTube. So the lectures from I think it would be the 2020 spring semester are up there. He only teaches it once a year, so it's always in the spring. But the 2020 lectures are up on YouTube. And they focus mostly on fantasy and science fiction. But that's what I generally write and generally what I read. So if that's what you're into, that's great. Something great to read because it goes through characters, setting, and plot, as well as just like it talks about the publishing industry as well, which is always good to know about. And it's just so much good stuff in there.
Huh.
So I highly recommend those as well. It's great that he puts them up for free on YouTube. So take a look.
Oh, that is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I've done a couple of writing projects myself, and I've been between those two things that you have talked about, between being an architect and a gardener.
Yes.
And the first story that I sat down to really map out, I was in high school. And
we all have those like kind of ideal stories that we want to write someday that have just been building over time and just gotten so much bigger than we initially planned them. And hopefully someday we can write them. But we have, at times, sorry, I'm trying to take this away from you, but like we idealize the stories so much that nothing will ever cut it for us just because we have like this kind of golden calf almost image of the story. And nothing we ever do will live up to that image. That's where I'm at a lot of times with some of the stuff that I've been planning since I was young.
So when I sat down to actually do this, I had this idea in my head, and I always had this pretty active imagination, and so I wanted to do this space story, and I had 120 pages and maybe more than that, of the storyboard that I put together.
120 pages. That's
Yeah.
incredible.
I was proud of this, right? I
Yeah.
had notes, I had pictures of like what I wanted to describe, like I would draw out pictures and everything. And I ended up stopping because I had this imposter syndrome kick in. I was like, who am I? Like I can't write it. I'm some kid in high school. I can't write a story. I'm just going to put this down. I'll wait until I'm older. So I put this down and I lost it. I have no idea where it went. And I still remember what the story was about,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the pieces of it. And one day I'll sit down and probably write it. Right, that's going to be a later in life project. But I was so bummed that I lost that book, right? That notebook with all of the thoughts and the images, everything that I had worked on with that. I'm hoping that maybe someday it just pops up when we're cleaning out my parents' basement or something. Like, oh, I found it. I'm hoping that is going to be the case, but I don't have high hopes for that. Much later, I sat down and I started doing a story that I had the idea in my head. I said, I'm going to skip all the effort of writing it all out ahead of time. I'm just going to start with the few points that I have and kind of the end goal. And I'm just going to start writing and see what happens. And so I did. And so I sat down and I would go in spurts over a number of years. But I've got about 150 pages to kind of play with that. And then I set it down. I'm like, who am I? I don't know if I can write. I don't know if I have the time for this. At this point, I'm in my mid-20s. So I said, maybe I'll come back to this. I still have that, and from time to time, I'll come back, I'll revisit, and I'll spend a little time on it. But two totally different ways of approaching the story. I couldn't tell you. I haven't finished either one of them, so I can tell you what works, but it is interesting to hear you say that there's two ways of approaching it, because I haven't thought about it in that way of, well, maybe I'm going to take the architecture route, or maybe I'm going to take the gardener route, but that's kind of fun to hear and think about.
Yeah. And it's a spectrum, right? Because when you do have a whole outline laid out, it's generally like points that you're trying to hit as you're going through, like bullet points. And you're still discovery writing between those points, essentially. So there's a spectrum where everyone does a little bit of both in some way, but because discovery writers, generally, you know the story you're trying to tell. So you have like a few events in mind that you're going to hit as you're going through. So you have some element of a vague outline at the same time. So it is definitely a spectrum. I lean much more towards the architect side in my own writing, but I'm probably going to. I did actually experiment a little bit with discovery writing here and there, or gardening. Discovery writing is another term for it. So, like, architect is to gardener as outline writer is to discovery writer, kind of in that sort of analogy way, or analogous way. But so I did try that with a short story once. I started it, and I just didn't think. I think I'd set myself up for failure because like the story idea wasn't well developed enough as it was. So it's a short story that I tried to write in my senior year about an old man who discovered an immortality potion in his old age, and so, but it was like he was going to stay the same age for the rest of his life. He was already old, so it's like he kind of wanted to die. So it was going to be more comedic too, and I'm not. I'd never really tried to write a comedy story before either, so yeah, kind of set myself up for failure.
Yeah, but you know what? Isn't failure just part of it?
It is. It definitely is. You grow from every failure. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good lesson even just for life. But
I have so many first chapters that I've written since I was in middle school that I either just abandoned or forgot about, or just various stories that I tried to start writing that, for whatever reason, I didn't get beyond like one or two chapters. Several versions of the same story too, that I've tried writing several times and still haven't gotten beyond like chapter 3.
So one of the, I think, powers of storytelling is that you're bringing people along for the ride. Not just in the sake of just having a reader, but you're leading them through different parts of the ups and the downs, the ins and the outs, and even in our own lives as a story, seeing some of that failure and getting back up. And we can apply that into writing and just maybe a how-to or like a manual. But when we apply that into our own life, and we say, hey, there's going to be times when we fail, there's going to be times when we're up, we're down, we're bringing people along the way. I mean, that's the story of discipleship in a way that I think becomes very tangible for anybody who listens into that. And when we think about like master storytelling, going back to the Gospels, you take a look at how these guys were being led by Jesus. I'm thinking of the apostles, right? That they had their ups and downs, they had their failures. And that's a very human element because that's repeated through time and history. And I think the Bible captures that element of us in a very strong and human way that I think anybody who's reading that can relate to it. And I like sitting down when I'm doing some story writing. I like emphasizing that failure piece and the rebound to victory, and I think that is something that I'm inspired because of the Gospels, because of Jesus' story in Scripture, is that victory piece, and I love victory, like just as a storytelling element because you're heading towards something that is achievable, but at a cost. And for anybody kind of come along for the ride, you have this victory piece that not a lot of people accept in their life. A lot of people will accept failure, and they'll sit there and be like, I'm a failure. I'm not coming back to do this again. I'm just going to quit. And that's not what we're called to do. And that's what I like in a good story, is when you have somebody who kind of rises to the occasion. And maybe they got beat up along the way, but then they get to this point of no return, where it's like the only thing I can climb out of this is victory, because the only other option is failure, and I'm not doing that. And there's plenty of movies and stories that I've seen where the opposite is true. Those kind of like those dark hero or those dark tone type of stories where it just doesn't fit well. At least not to my heart. Some people really get a kick out of that, those dark type of movies, but I don't like that. So, I don't know. What's your take on that victory element and applying that between stories and real life?
That's a great question. I definitely agree with you that there are a lot of stories these days that are on the darker side, and with that kind of anti-hero or like sympathetic villain sort of thing. And sometimes sympathetic, every villain should have a motivation, of course.
Sure.
But, sometimes villains can be too sympathetic, or they can glorify things that shouldn't be glorified. But, that I do like, stories, kind of like I said earlier, that have characters striving to be good people, striving to be virtuous, striving to be honorable. And, it's important, I guess, to show that people can have that victory, as you said, because there are a lot of things that we as humans struggle with. We all struggle with certain sins and things like that. And it's important to know that victory is possible. Now, granted, most of us aren't going up like slaying literal dragons or, saving the world or things like that, right? But kind of showing victory against all odds is important to see sometimes, because sometimes that's what it feels like a lot to us, like to be, I guess, I know I'm kind of taking like that sin sort of angle, but like to be, sometimes when we struggle with certain sins, it can feel like it'll be impossible to get out of, that there's no chance. And that's what happens in a lot of books, is that there are characters who uh, can't can't see a way to achieve victory, and yet they achieve it in the end anyway. And it's kind of important to see things like that, so that we too can know that there's a chance for us to be victorious, for us to achieve an end to a part in our own character arcs of becoming better people and striving for virtue and things like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I feel like there's a lot that we can dive back into this with. This might actually be a good place to kind of tie things up. So, with writing in our storytelling, what do you think is the next step? And not by ours, I mean yours.
Okay.
With your storytelling, what is the next step here? I mean, you're still in school, you're working on your stories. Where do you go from here?
That's a great question. I've said that a lot. And I know the answer to this question, so I don't need to say that's a great question or to stall. So I don't know why I said that this time. But anyway, so I'm going to say that's a good question again. So
Good question.
It is a good question.
I'm here to ask good questions. It is water talk, after all.
Indeed. Oh, okay.
There
we
it is.
go. But next step would be to finish the novel, of course, the one that I'm working on right now. There are no rules that say like college students can't publish or things like that. Like college students have published, high school students have published novels. So once I finish it, I've my whole time writing this, I've been sort of on the fence about whether or not I want to publish this, because a lot of times authors don't get their first several novels published. Like Brandon Sanderson wrote 5 novels before he published one, and then the 6th one got published, and then it was another and then the next one he ended up publishing was his 12th novel. So out of 11 novels that he wrote, 1 got published. Fine, and then until he finally really broke in.
Now, is that because it is his choice where he's sitting on them, or that through the publishing process he didn't get it through?
I think some of them were his choice, and some of them were just the publishing process not quite working out as he'd hoped.
Interesting.
And so, for me, I might send it to a publisher, but it's my first novel. You don't send it to a publisher, you send it to editors at publishers. But I might try to do that. I'd probably try to do it through an agent. So first see if an agent will take my submission and then float it to other editors. But it's a possibility. But it's my first novel, so I might want to see how once I'm done with my first novel. It'd be nice. I'll kind of learn the ropes finally. Written a whole novel, because I've never really written an ending before. Written plenty of beginnings, but I've never written an ending before of a longer piece. So, using the skills from my first novel to write a really strong second novel, try and kind of shop that around, see if I can sell it to anyone. So there's different options. We'll see what happens. But right now I'm leaning towards at least sending it to some publishers.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to see what happens.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, and then after that, after I'm done with the novel, it's a series, so I'd probably just keep working through the next volumes in the series, which means I wouldn't get to the Triad project anytime soon. But we'll see.
I'm excited to see what you're putting out. I did read The Fog Turns Red.
Yes.
It's one of his short stories.
Yes, one that I wrote when I was in high school for that writing club. So this was
okay.
like 2 years ago now. So a lot of stuff you haven't seen yet.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited to see more of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, hey, keep it coming. Keep putting it out there. And if you ever put it up online or put it in a place where people can see, we'll tell you guys about it.
Yes, definitely. And now that school's ending, I'll have time if I want to try and put a website together. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Put it up on WordPress.
Yeah.
Nice and easy.
Mm-hmm. Simple.
Mm-hmm. Well, hey, this was great.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. It was a pleasure.
You could say it's epic.
Oh, it was definitely epic.
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 As the Edgies would say.
Indeed. They definitely would say.
Shout out to you, Edge folks. Actually, I don't know if any Edge kids are listening to this.
Probably not.
But maybe they will because you're on here.
Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah. Because I always, for extra context, I always use the word epic in my Edge talks. I often stand up and say, Jesus is epic. Or something like that. That's how I start my talks. And then the kids all go wild.
Awesome.
Yes. It's epic.
It's epic.
Yeah.
Well, do you think you can close this with an epic prayer?
I could try. All right. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation about writing and to discuss stories and how they affect our lives. We just pray that all of those who are aspiring to be writers or who already are published writers may always create stories that glorify you and glorify those values that you want us as humans to possess. We just pray, too, that we might also achieve that victory from whatever struggles and sins that we are suffering through. Just that we can find our own triumphs, even in the face of what may seem like challenging odds, that by lifting our hearts up to you, we may work with you to achieve that victory. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you,
This is
Evan.
great.
It was a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Yes, it's delightful.
It's epic.
Indeed.
Hey, thank you for tuning in to Coffee Talk. If this was something that you liked, feel free to subscribe, like it, share it, pass it along, and take a look at the bunch of other Coffee Talks that we've had as well. So, conversation for everybody, and it's a great way to be able to take a look at how to have actual faithful conversations in your own life. So, it's kind of the hope of this is to be able to just give an example of what does it mean to even have a conversation like this? And not saying this is a perfect conversation. No conversation needs to be perfect when coming to the faith and just bringing that to your friends and your family. So always feel free to crack open a coffee, drink of choice,
water,
and sit down and just get conversing. Just talk about it, And it's a journey. So no matter where you find yourself on that journey, know that Jesus loves you, and so do we. Have a great day.
Stay epic.
Stay epic.